Welcome to the Humanities Forum. My name is Ian Bernhoft, and I direct the forum, which happens most Fridays during the semester in this very room. Occasionally Thursday, so for example, next Thursday instead of a Friday, but usually Fridays at 3:30 here. And the Humanities program hosts these events in conjunction with supporters and campus partners in order to promote the shared intellectual life of the Providence College community. At the forum, we invite guest speakers who are experts in their field, influential authors, scholars, original thinkers, to share their research and to ask the big questions. Because the humanities, properly understood, don't just live in books, right, in sort of the old books that you read in class. They also live in conversations, in shared ideas, in shared inquiry, and we hope by bringing you to the forum to bring those sorts of questions and that inquiry to life for you. So there are three things you need to do in order to participate in the forum, and right now I'm speaking especially to the students. Number one is you got to shut those electronic devices down. You can take notes by hand. You can see the YouTube transcription when it pops up, but you don't need your devices. You want to be present in the room. Number two is to, as you listen critically and formulate a question. More than one if you want, but definitely a question, because we're going to have time for questions at the end. And listening critically like that is a really good way to hone your skills and to engage with the material. And then number three, the last thing, and this is more of an advice than requirement, is you really ought to join us down the hall afterwards for the reception in the great room, immediately following this talk. Now, today's lecture is our annual St. Albert the Great lecture in Science and the Humanities. A generous supporter of the Humanities program has endowed this lecture in honor of Louis Verza. It's also co-sponsored by the Abigail Adams Institute, which is an independent scholarly institute dedicated to providing supplementary humanities education to the intellectual community at Harvard and beyond. The Abigail Adams Institute hosts and sponsors lectures, seminars, discussions, workshops, cultural outings, and reading groups in a spirit of free and open inquiry. Okay. So let me now introduce our guest today. Professor Martin Nowak is a professor of mathematics and biology at Harvard University. He's a leading researcher in the area of I scanned too quickly. In the areas of theoretical and evolutionary biology. Professor Nowak's work has helped to create fields such as evolutionary dynamics, virus dynamics, mathematical oncology, the evolution of cooperation, evolutionary graph theory, and indirect reciprocity. Before coming to Harvard in 2003, he held professorships at the University of Oxford and at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And he's authored more than 500 papers, many of which are in Nature and in Science, and 6 books that have shaped the field, including virus dynamics, evolutionary dynamics, and supercooperators. His contributions have been recognized with honors in many countries around the world. And his 2 most recent books, though, entitled Beyond and Within, respectively, are contemplative studies of questions that arise at the intersections of science, philosophy, and religion. And he'll be speaking in part about that intersection today. So with that, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Nowak.
Thank you very much. It's a great joy and honor for me to be here. And the title of my talk is, Does Evolution Lead Us to God? And we all may have encountered somehow an uneasiness among Christian believers and evolution. And so I want to ask why there would be an uneasiness. The Catholic Church actually doesn't have a problem with evolution. But the Catholic Church, for example, has invited me twice to Rome to speak on evolution because they still want to know what it means that evolution is random and so, and how does this go about with God's providence. So I want to discuss those things. So there is a kind of uneasiness, and I think the uneasiness only is because we misunderstand what evolution actually is. So on the other hand, if I talk to people who are not necessarily believers, sometimes I hear the argument, I don't need God, I have evolution. And this is what surprises me very, very much. So then I say, wow, that's amazing. Why did you say evolution? Why not gravity or quantum mechanics or relativity theory? What it is about evolution that replaces God? So what I want to argue in my talk today really is that once you develop a proper understanding of evolution, it is not in any way taking away from God, it is bringing you closer to God. So I will answer the question in the affirmative in two different ways, and you will see that. But before I go there, I want to say that the most formative years of my life, 12 years exactly, I spent, because this is the Albert the Great lecture. So for 12 years, I went to this school in Vienna, and this school is called Albertus Magnus Schule. So I entered it when I was 6 years old, and I left when I was 18 years old. It was a Catholic school, and I can tell you it was academically the most challenging thing that I experienced in my life. And afterwards, Oxford, Princeton, Harvard were trivial in comparison. So this is actually where the real stuff for me developed. But with respect to my faith, when I was 6 years old and when I entered the school, God was a real presence in my life, and I never doubted this. So I came to that school already as a very, very strong believer, even though I couldn't really talk about those things. And for many years, then later as a scientist, I was often challenged for being a believer, and I didn't have the words to reply. I only learned those words when I came to Harvard and I met Sarah Coakley. She was a professor of theology at that time in Harvard, and she really taught me Catholic theology, actually, and this opened also my ability to talk about those things and the things that I'm writing about right now. In any case, the school was called Albertus Magnus, and we had like a hymn dedicated to Albertus Magnus. And as you know, Albertus Magnus, he has a statue, Albertus Magnus, in Cologne. He was the greatest scientist of his time. And the Dominicans, of course, sent Thomas Aquinas from Rome to Paris to study with Albertus Magnus, with the greatest scientist of the time. And so he traveled like 800 or 1,000 kilometers to arrive at Paris and realized that Albertus Magnus wasn't there. So Thomas Aquinas immediately left for Cologne and spent 3 years with him at Cologne before he returned to Paris. And for me, of course, Aquinas is one of the greatest philosophers of all time. So I belong to those people who would say this. And once in a lecture, I heard that there are people who fiercely disagree with this statement. They would definitely deny that Aquinas was the greatest philosopher of all times. But those people would still agree with the statement that he was the greatest philosopher in the 2,000 years between Aristotle and Descartes. And I think that's also quite good. So we will encounter some thinking of Aquinas in the talk here also, of course. And I will start, however, with two other people who were the greatest scientists of their time. And this is Newton and Einstein. And sometimes I like to show the people not sort of in these well-known old portraits when they were kind of boring and a bit slow, but when they really had actually the young energy in them, when they made their main discoveries. So Einstein and Newton, they felt the need to explain a static universe. This is very interesting. So by the time Newton had his equations, Newtonian mechanics, he asked himself, but how does this explain an unchanging universe? Because to him, at the time, it was obvious that the heavens were unchanging. The stars were sort of these fixed stars. And the planets were going in fixed orbits. There was nothing that was changing there. And he made one of the very few mistakes in his life. He said, mathematical mistakes, maybe he made many other mistakes, but mathematical mistakes, there were not many. This is one of them. He said, the only way how my equations can explain a static universe is to assume the universe is infinitely large and has uniform mass density everywhere, and then there's no center of gravity and there's no gravitational collapse, and it is stable. And modern physics knows that's a wrong calculation. If the universe was like this, it would still undergo gravitational collapse, and every point would be a center of gravity. It was one of the few mathematical mistakes of Newton. Now, forward in time, a few centuries, Einstein. Once Einstein had the equation of general relativity, he asked the same question. How does my equation explain a static universe? Because the universe is static by physical evidence. And so then he introduced a force that acts against gravity, the cosmological constant. And he himself called this the biggest mistake that he ever made in his life. Now, actually, it isn't such a big mistake because it is very much that which we now call dark energy. But interestingly, it all changed. And it all changed in the beginning of the 20th century. And it was based on the work of these two people. One of them a Catholic priest, George Lemaitre, and other one an American astronomer, Edwin Hubble. And they discovered the universe isn't static. The universe is actually changing. The universe is expanding. This was one of the biggest frame shifts in science in the 20th century. We are not dealing with a universe that is unchanging. We are dealing with a universe that is changing, very much changing, in the sense of aging. It is actually aging. So they measured the motion of galaxies. The galaxies are moving away from each other. So they asked, when we follow this motion back, we might come to this point where all these galaxies come out of this stuff, this one point, you know. And so there was a big debate in physics there between those who said, no, that's wrong, you know, even though it looks like it, the universe is actually static, and others say, no, the universe is coming from this. And there was the famous astronomer, British astronomer, Fred Hoyle, and he was on the side of a static universe. And he said those people who think of a dynamic universe, they might even be so deluded as to postulate that there was such a thing as a Big Bang. So this was a derogative. So this was a put down somehow. But later, he was the person, of course, who coined the term Big Bang. Later he said, I didn't want to say it's a derogative. I wanted to name this physical phenomenon. So now, he's also extremely famous for discovering how the stars make chemical elements. And that's nucleosynthesis that's happening in stars. Before him, people thought the Big Bang makes the chemical elements. His work shows the stars make the chemical elements. And the triple alpha reaction is one of the most miraculous things in the universe that feeds the universe with enough oxygen and carbon. So now what we have is this Big Bang. So this is an artist's impression, but the idea is somehow that this universe, as we know it, comes out of this singularity or so and then expands. And forms the galaxies and so on. So the universe had a beginning, and the universe is changing over time, and it's aging, and it will run out of either, so there are two possibilities. Either it will sort of expand forever, and it will become extremely cold, and no light and nothing will stay. Black holes, the last things that they will evaporate is Hawking radiation. Or the other possibility is the gravitation will bring it back to a collapse. In any case, the future is not very bright, so the collapse would be a gigantic disaster like the reversal of a Big Bang or something. Long time scales. But the interesting thing is that the universe had a beginning, the universe is aging, fewer stars will be born in the future, and planet formation is peaking right now. So many stars have already been formed. And compared to the stars that have been formed, fewer will be formed in the future. But planet formation, that is happening right now somehow. I should also mention, when Thomas Aquinas was in Paris, whether the universe had a beginning or not was a big philosophical debate. And the argument that I find very interesting, there were some who said, it cannot be that time is infinite in the past, because if there was an infinite time before the present moment, there wouldn't have been enough time for the present moment to arrive. So this was an argument against the idea that the universe extends infinitely into the past. And Aquinas rejected that, actually, that argument. So Aquinas thought philosophically you cannot prove whether the universe had a beginning or not. You have to rely on scripture. So the modern physics works like this. It talks about an observable universe. So the observable universe around us is a sphere, and we are in the center of that sphere. Again, we are in the center. And even better than that, each observer has her own observable universe, her own sphere. So we are sitting in the center of an observable universe. When we talk about a number like the size of the universe, we actually talk about the size of the observable universe, not the actual universe. The actual universe could be much, much bigger than the observable universe. The observable universe is that area of space and time that in principle can be in contact with us, could have been in contact with us. And beyond this is something that cannot reach us because the speed of light is limited. So the size of the observable universe is 93 billion light years. The Big Bang was 13.8 billion years ago. So that number should surprise you. The radius is more than light could actually travel in that time. And the explanation is because it is not just light traveling, it is the space itself that is expanding. So the space itself is expanding, and therefore that's the size of the observable universe that we have right now. So the precise statement in physics is that what we now see as the cosmic background radiation, that was the first glimmer of light approximately 380,000 years after the Big Bang, that was emitted by matter that has now traveled to a distance which is this distance away from us. So in the observable universe, there are 10 to the 80 heavy particles. This is all the particles that stuff is made of, hadrons. There are 10 to the 22 stars. There are 10 to the 11 galaxies. We can now, these are very firm numbers, you know, we can sort of more on the estimation side, we estimate there are 10 to the 9 Earth-like planets in our own galaxy. An Earth-like planet is one that is not too large so as to be a gas giant, because gas giants would be too boring for their chemistry, and it has to be in the right zone from the star. So the current estimate is approximately 1 billion planets similar to ours in our galaxy alone. But we are surrounded by 10 to the 11 galaxies. So the estimate is 10 to the 20 Earth-like planets in the observable universe. This is a gigantic number. So this is much, much more than the number of galaxies, of course. So this is a huge number. And in some sense, theology and philosophy has to deal with that. So we have to think what it means to be in a universe that has so many habitats for life. So if life is a natural phenomenon, which I think it is, it should be present in many, many places in the universe. And so in many places in the universe, we should find also intelligent life with people who have religion, who pray. We can also ask questions like how many cells are there on Earth, or how many meters of DNA is there on Earth, which is kind of amusing because the total amount of DNA, if you put it together in one long, long string, it is more than the diameter of the observable universe. So this is the time scale of the major events. The Big Bang happened 13.8 billion years ago. Sun, Earth, Moon formed 4.6 billion years ago. There was an origin of life, but we don't know if it was on Earth, and we don't know exactly when it was. Most people think the origin of life happened on Earth. It could have been, in principle, that bacterial spores came to Earth. That's possible. But what we can say with certainty is by 3.5 billion years ago, the world was a world that was covered with bacteria and archaea. So this is very firm scientific evidence, 3.5 billion years. It is a planet that is alive, and life is carried by these simple cells that we call prokaryotes. And then eukaryotes, these are cells with organelles, so cells that make animals and plants, cells that have a nucleus. They came about 1.8 billion years ago. Complex multicellularity, 600 million years ago. So only 600 million years ago, for the first time, you would have life forms that you see without a microscope. Before this, life was only microscopic. And human language, approximately 1 million years ago. We don't know exactly, but we split from chimpanzee 7 million years ago, and all humans have language, and chimpanzees don't have language, so of order of magnitude, 1 million years. And these big events in evolution are explained actually by, to some extent explained, I should say, by the abundance of oxygen. So in the beginning, the planet had no oxygen in the atmosphere, and the oxygen started to rise 2.5 billion years ago in the great oxygenation event. And afterwards, we have eukaryotes, because eukaryotes started with an aerobic lifestyle, with a lifestyle where they need oxygen. And the second step in oxygen then gave rise to multicellular animals and plants, because they need even more oxygen because they have to bring oxygen inside. So the accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere triggered these adaptations that we call eukaryotes, plants, and animals. And what produced the oxygen? The oxygen was produced by cyanobacteria as a waste product, because cyanobacteria discovered one of the most important chemical reactions of life, oxygenic photosynthesis. So they discovered a way how to split water, to take energy from the sun and build sugar, and the waste product is oxygen. And that's the oxygen we have in the atmosphere. So this is on a finer scale. We are distinguishing these 4 eons of Earth history, the Hadean, the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic, and all these big important steps that happened there. And then you can blow up the last 500 million years. And you see also these crosses here. These are actually the mass extinctions, 5 great mass extinctions. This last mass extinction ended the age of the dinosaurs. But what is not drawn here is the 6th mass extinction. So the 6th mass extinction is the one that is happening right now. And the cause for that, that's us. We are triggering a mass extinction of killing species on Earth to a tremendous amount. And that is extremely unfortunate, and it's a disaster. And it is ultimately undermining our own ecological habitat. So this is somehow the unfolding of evolution. And now I want to take a step back and discuss with you how humans came to discover this idea of evolution. So let's go to the history of science, and let's ask who discovered evolution and in what context and how did it happen. And one actually has to start not with Darwin, but with this person, Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet Chevalier de Lamarck. And he published a book in 1809, which was called Philosophie zoologique. And he proposed this idea of evolution. And so what he said was actually he had this idea that there is a spontaneous generation of life from matter. So it's like an origin of life, but it happens again and again. And then along these lines, there's a complexifying force. He believed in transmission of acquired characteristics, which is normally called Lamarckian, but Darwin believed that also. But he also invented terms like biology. He invented the term invertebrates. So his contribution to biology is tremendous. He had not this idea of an origin of life and a tree of life. He had these many different origins of life. So continuously inorganic matter gives rise to bacteria. And as they complexify over time, they become eukarya, and then they become higher, and so on. So this was these parallel lines of evolution. This is how he envisaged this. This is the true Lamarckian evolution. So in 1809, Lamarck publishes his book. And in 1809, Charles Darwin is born. And then Darwin was a student in Edinburgh and in Cambridge. And when Darwin was a student in Edinburgh and Cambridge, evolution was the talk of the town. Everybody talked about evolution. In the same way as everybody talks about LLMs right now, AI. Everybody talked about evolution, and those crazy people who believed in evolution, they were called Lamarckists. So it was even associated with Lamarck. So Darwin was supposed to study medicine. He failed because he couldn't really stand these surgeries on children without anesthesia. So he came back home to his father as a failure. The father was very powerful, sent him to Cambridge to study theology. In theology, he learned his devotion for beetle and geology, but he didn't really become a theologian. So in any case, then he went on this voyage of the Beagle. The Beagle was a Royal Navy ship that went around the world, and the captain needed a gentleman passenger to have dinner with. Because either for 5 years the captain has dinner alone, or he has somebody to talk to, but that cannot be somebody from the crew, so he needs a paying passenger, and that was Charles Darwin. And so Darwin came along, and he was this young man, and he collected all these samples, and he put them into barrels, and whenever they found a Royal Navy ship going in the other direction, he put these barrels, and they sent him back to London. And so then when he came home after 5 years, he was actually already celebrated there because people were interested in those things that he had sent back. So he studied the natural world. And this gave him an insight. This gave him an idea. And then for years, he worked on writing down his ideas. And he completed this work in 1842, and it was called the Pencil Sketch. The Pencil Sketch was a 30-page manuscript in detail describing the theory of evolution by natural selection. But there's something very beautiful in 1837 in this notebook here. He has this drawing, and above this drawing it says, I think. And there for the first time, a human being is drawing this tree. And this tree, the idea is the tree gives different species. So evolution gives rise to different species. So not like in Aristotelian biology where every species is like a fixed form or so. Evolution gives rise to a variety of forms and they are all related. So this is the first tree of evolution. So he showed this idea to a very good friend of his, and the friend read it and said, yeah, plausible, but why don't you collect more evidence for it? And Darwin took his advice, and for 10 years he withdrew, and he studied barnacles. He became the leading expert on barnacles and didn't really publish his ideas. And then one day he gets a letter, and the letter was sent from Indonesia or somewhere, and a British naturalist was active there, and this name was Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace was also doing field studies there, and then he had like some fever, and then he was just thinking, and then as he was thinking, he also had read Malthus. He then had the idea of evolution by natural selection. He wrote an essay. He described evolution by natural selection in exactly the same way as Darwin, and sent the essay back to England, and he knew that Darwin was interested in these things, and he said, please read my paper. If you find some value in it, please send it to some journal for publication, which is a very funny practice. You send your discovery to your competitor and ask him to send it for publication. But in any case, Darwin gets this letter and was shocked because he realized he had been scooped. Because everything that he had been working on, it was exactly also described by Wallace. And Darwin asked his friends for advice, and his friends said, calm down. We will organize a reading to the Linnaean Society, and in this reading we will read his letter, and we will read your letters and your collected papers, even a letter that you sent to a Harvard professor from some decade back or so, and we will show to the Linnaean Society that the two of you are co-discoverers of evolution. And that was kind of the agreement. So this reading to the Linnaean Society happened in 1858, and in that sense, Darwin and Wallace published on natural selection as co-discoverers. And Wallace, of course, was in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, wherever. He didn't even know about this. But he was only later informed about this, that this was sort of this reading that happened there. And he then said, oh, I don't mind, I just don't need to do anything else right now. Darwin should have time to publish his book. So he stepped back and gave Darwin the first place, which was very nice and gentlemanlike. And then in 1859, a year later, Darwin publishes On the Origin of the Species. And it's a sensation, of course. It's a tremendous sensation. But the important thing is, what we have learned is that they're co-discoverers of evolution. So there's Charles Darwin, and there's Alfred Russel Wallace, and they both had the same idea and kind of the right idea. We have to know this from history of science. We should know this. So the question is this all to the story? Or is there something else coming? Is there a footnote out there? There's actually a footnote. So there was so much sensation about Darwin's publication, and it was in many, many magazines. And then one magazine basically got a letter from a reader, and that reader was a Scotsman by the name of Patrick Matthew. And the letter basically said, what is all this fuss? Why are you so excited about this so-called new discovery? I described this in my book in 1831. So in 1831, Patrick Matthew writes in a book on naval timber, there is a law universal in nature tending to render every reproductive being the best possible suited to its condition. This law sustains the lion in his strength, the hare in her swiftness, and so on. As nature in all her modifications of life has a power of increase, this is exponential selection. Far beyond what is needed to supply the place of what falls by time's decay, only those individuals who possess the strengths without reproducing, their place being occupied by the more perfect one of their own kind. It's exactly evolution by natural selection. Exactly. So what happened next? Darwin replied to that letter. Darwin replies in 1860, I have been much interested by Mr. Patrick Matthew's communication in the number of your paper dated April 7th. I freely acknowledge that Mr. Matthew has anticipated by many years the explanation which I have offered to the origin of species under the name of natural selection. I think that no one will feel surprised that neither I nor apparently any other naturalist had heard of Mr. Matthews' views, considering how briefly they are given and that they appeared in an appendix to a work on naval timber and arboriculture. I can do no more than offer my apologies to Mr. Matthew for my entire ignorance of his publication. If another edition of my work is called for, I will insert a notice to the foregoing effect. And did he? Did he do that? And the answer is yes. In the third edition of The Origin of Species, he actually put a footnote there. So Mr. Matthew was satisfied, and he had a business card printed, Discoverer of Evolution by Natural Selection. So when he knocks at your door, this is the card that you get from him. So is this the end of the story? That's it now? Is there something else? Well, James Hutton in 1794 uses natural selection for improvement of varieties. William Charles Wells in 1813 proposes that natural selection can lead to new varieties. Edward Blyth in 1835 uses natural selection as a process to preserve the unchanging essence of a stable species. This is very funny. Darwin was the last one to discover evolution. After him, nobody discovered evolution again. That's the contribution. And that's an important contribution. So the only thing that Darwin said that is not there is that natural selection gives rise to new species. And his strongest supporters did not believe that. So after him, that was not believed of his story. Everything else was believed, but not the one point that would have been novel. This was only laid down by the Harvard biologist Ernst Mayr, in Ernst Mayr's own opinion, much later, how natural selection gives rise to species. So in any case, this is somehow the anecdotes and the stories for the discovery of evolution, and it's amusing. But when Darwin died, there were three objections to evolution, actually. Darwin died in 1882, and three problems were there, really, with the theory. The first was the age of the sun. The most important physicist, Lord Kelvin, had calculated the age of the sun to be 200,000 years. Kelvin did not know nuclear synthesis, he did not know fusion. So he only had like chemistry in mind, and he thought that something is burning there, and for how long could it possibly burn? Approximately 200,000 years. So Darwin was given that number and felt that's maybe not enough. I need more than that. But what can I say if the physicists tell me that's the age of the sun? That was a problem. The second problem was even bigger. An engineer pointed out to him, you only talk about blending inheritance. So this is the model that Darwin had in mind, blending inheritance. If you imagine like parents, mother and father, and they have sort of a bit of a height difference, then somehow the children will average out that. They will be between them. And so if that is actually happening, if you start out with everybody being slightly different tall, and then after some time everybody has the same height. And if everybody has the same height, then there's no evolution anymore, because evolution has come to a halt. And so this Darwin could not answer. And Darwin himself said, if a person can actually show a trait in a species that is there for the benefit of another species, that would be an argument against my theory. And that's what we call cooperation these days. So the answer to the second question really came with the work of another Catholic priest, an Austrian abbot, Gregor Mendel. And as you know, he made these experiments with peas, and he discovered genetics. He discovers particulate inheritance. This was published in 1865 and 1866. In the Brünn Academy of Sciences, but Darwin did not know about this. So Darwin read widely, but he never read Mendel. When Mendel was finally discovered by the evolutionary biologists, it was a crisis, and they didn't really know how to bring it together with Darwinian evolution, and that led to this population, the birthplace of population genetics, to the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and the beginning of a mathematical engagement with evolution, actually. And the people who are mostly associated with this are Sir Ronald Fisher in England and G.B.S. Holden in England and Civil Wright in the US. This is the beginning of a mathematical study of evolution, really. So what is it that evolves? What is really the principle of evolution? And that is the question that is asked by Ernst Mayr in his book. And he gives a very nice answer, because loosely speaking, we talk about evolution of species, evolution of the brain, evolution of genes, but the only thing that actually evolves are populations. The only carrier of the evolutionary process is a population of reproducing individuals. And in that population, then, you have mutation as giving rise to something new. And you have selection as a principle where different types reproduce at different rates. And something is faster, something is slower, and something outcompetes something else. And this is selection. But to these two fundamental principles, my own work over the last 20 or 30 years has really added that we should think of cooperation as a fundamental principle of evolution. And by cooperation, I mean that individuals help one another, and that can become so strong that it forms a new level of organization. So in some sense, it is wrong to think of cooperation as a phenomenon that occurs in the biological world. It's actually a fundamental principle that I would align with mutation selection. And evolution should be thought of as not just competition, but sometimes it's competition, sometimes it's cooperation. So I have argued that cooperation is the master architect of evolution, and that cooperation is necessary to get an origin of life in the pre-life theory. It is necessary for protocells, for cells, for genomes, cellular organelles, eukaryotes, multicellularity, animal societies, human language. So without cooperation, we would not have any of that. And cooperation leads to higher levels of biological organization. So in my proposal, the classical view of evolution is just two forces, mutation and selection. And that's terrible, because that leads to a worldview where Darwinian evolution is just fierce competition. It is red in tooth and claw. It has led to political ideologies in the 20th century that led to world wars, because it was applied to fight between nations for space to live and so. And also, if evolution is just fight, a ruthless fight, everybody against everybody else, how weird is it then that of humans we should then expect them to behave differently? And therefore, it makes all the difference in the world to add cooperation as a third fundamental principle. So evolution is not only competition, it's also cooperation. It was cooperation from the beginning. The great discoveries of evolution are impossible without cooperation. And cooperation is really a preparation for altruism, for agape, and for love. So this is where we can ground those human principles in our evolutionary history. So cooperation means helping others, that you help others even if they're competitors. So you pay a cost for others to have a benefit. And natural selection actually chooses defection if cooperators pay a cost and defectors have no cost, but they still get the benefits. Then natural selection wipes out cooperators and defectors take over. And therefore, natural selection needs help to favor cooperators over defectors, because cooperation is there and cooperation is widespread, so there are mechanisms in place. So there are many thousands of scientific papers that have been written on how natural selection can help cooperators over defectors. And in 2006, I subdivided them into 5 mechanisms, and these are the 5 mechanisms for evolution of cooperation, and they're called direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, spatial selection, group selection, kin selection. And I will mention 2 of those mechanisms in my talk today. So the one is direct reciprocity. Direct reciprocity is based on repetition. So we play the game again and again. And if we play the game again and again, then my cooperation now could induce you to cooperate tomorrow. On the other hand, if I defect now, you might defect tomorrow and I harm myself. But very important, and this was in my PhD thesis in Vienna already, that this evolution of cooperation by direct reciprocity requires forgiveness. Forgiveness in the sense that if somebody exploits you, you have to move on to find back to cooperation afterwards. This was in my PhD thesis. Without forgiveness, the mechanism doesn't actually work. And then there's indirect reciprocity, and indirect reciprocity is based on reputation. And reputation is sort of the idea that you want to do unto others as you want them to do to you. And of course, this is the Good Samaritan, Vincent van Gogh painting of the Good Samaritan. So this is not like a repeated interaction, but somehow you help somebody because you want to have the reputation of somebody who is helpful, Mother Teresa. And then this person is the New York subway hero. and he was waiting there with his daughters on the way to school, and somebody else had an epileptic seizure, and he jumped down. This person with the seizure fell in front of the train, so this person jumped down to get him up, and then realized it was too late, and then put him flat down and put himself over it, and the train passed over both of them unharmed. And so he saved his life, and he was very celebrated, and rightly so. And what is very interesting is very few of us would be heroes like he, but all of us would be deeply concerned to see something happening to a complete stranger like this. And this is the question, why do we have this? So if it was just competition, then it is just another competitor is out of the way. You know, it's not just competition. It is this togetherness, this cooperation. This is the deep instinct in humans. If we see a person falling in the street, we want to help. And this makes no sense if evolution is only competition. But so the important thing is this winning strategies of reciprocity are generous, hopeful, and forgiving. And this is where natural selection begins to see those traits that we like to see in people. So forgiving is this one trait that I mentioned. You have to move on after somebody treated you badly. Hopeful means that if you meet a new person, you have to be hopeful you can establish cooperation. So you start always in a very cooperative move. But generous is a very important property. And generous is where most people fail. And this is in any one interaction you are willing to lose. But overall, you have many good interactions. And this is what most people can't do. They want to win in most pairwise encounters, and thereby they destroy everything. So this is the big differentiation between what we call partners and rivals in game theory. A rival has to win in any one encounter, and thereby destroys everything. A partner is somebody who says, I'm willing to lose. I will lose many games in my life, but still I will incentivize people to cooperate with me. And that overall allows cooperation and gives a much higher payoff. So this was a summary of evolution, and now I want to come to the actual topic of the talk. Does evolution lead us to God? And as Ian mentioned, I have written these two books, contemplative books, prayer books. My activity of writing them feels to me like praying, and I want to mention a bit more about those books toward the end of my talk, but I discussed this question, does evolution lead us to God, in both of those books. The first answer I have to this question is that it's a historical evidence. You know, it's evidently, it has been the case on this planet. Evolution leads to awareness of God. So evolution is a force that acts on living matter. On this planet, it has operated for over 3.5 billion years. It has brought about individuals who are aware of God, who raise their voices, human language, in praise of God, who do mathematics, science, philosophy, poetry, music, in search of truth, which is God, in search of love, which is God. So it's a historical fact that evolution leads to God. So evolution and the forces of physics cooperate. They bring about awareness of God. If you look at the stars seed the universe with prayer, because the stars make the chemical elements that are needed for the origin of life. And then once the chemical elements accumulate on a planet, the stars provide the energy for that life to grow. So the stars incubate life in the universe. And if evolution then of this life leads to intelligent life, the first thing that intelligent life does, it starts to pray. I argue the oldest evidence that we have of human ancestors that actually had language is expression of spirituality. The cave paintings, they are kind of prayers because they have no other purpose. I wouldn't say Homo sapiens, I would say Homo spiritualis. Language makes that being spiritual. So this was the first way how evolution leads to God. The second way is kind of the scientific understanding. Understanding the science of evolution brings us closer to God. This is my argument. And how does this work? Because evolution, like other processes in nature, follow mathematical laws. And those laws reside in an unchanging reality. So the material unfolding of the universe and of life is guided by principles that are beyond time and beyond matter. And you can call that God. So all of science follows mathematics. And where is mathematics? So mathematics is not in matter. Mathematics is also not in time, because a mathematical truth is forever. So it's an immaterial, timeless world that is populated by mathematics. But every scientific process is dependent on that world. So this is the argument from mathematics. The current perspective that you might find at university campuses, maybe not like this one, but at Harvard, is that the material world is all there is, and science will explain everything. So this is a kind of materialism, this is a kind of scientism. So to that, my answer is, hang on, science does not explain mathematics. If you say science explains everything, why is it that mathematics is not explained by science? A mathematical truth is not a consequence of a scientific experiment. A mathematical theorem, once proven, does not require a scientific test. It is true in itself. Already Augustine realized this. So a mathematical truth for him is an intelligible object, and you judge it by a criterion that is inside you. And that's the doctrine of divine illumination. So on the other hand, the best possible science that we have is completely dependent on mathematics. Science, physics, also in evolutionary biology, computer science cannot do without mathematics. The actual laws are written in the language of mathematics. Science needs mathematics. Mathematics kind of governs science. The laws of nature are mathematical objects. But these mathematical objects, they are not in matter, they're not in the material world. And for me, this is the way to actually make a step toward God, because the step toward God is that the material world is completely guided by an immaterial, unchanging world. And you can call that God. And I think now the argument is more potent than it was before, because Plato and Aristotle held mathematics in very high regard, but they couldn't have imagined that mathematics was the language of all of nature. For them, it was something very specific, something almost artificial. For Plato, it was above common opinions or so, but it was below an intuition of the forms themselves. Of course, Galileo Galilei said the language of nature is written in mathematics, but he meant physics. He only meant physics. But now we realize everything will be mathematics. Not only biology, but also psychology, also cognitive science, also philosophy. Even mathematics itself has to be studied with mathematics, as meta-mathematics becomes mathematics. So how does this fit into a theistic worldview? It makes a lot of sense. The thoughts of God are surely the most ordered thoughts and the most beautiful thoughts. And so here is this Aristotelian expression, gnosis. But clearly mathematics is the most ordered thinking. And also mathematics is indescribably beautiful. So the world is mathematical because the world is made by God, and God's thoughts are mathematical. The world is beautiful because mathematics is beautiful. This fits together. So science studies the material world of change as it follows immaterial, unchanging mathematical laws. This is the activity of science. Science studies secondary causes by choice. Secondary causes are those causes that have like physical interactions with each other. Science, however, does not prove or disprove primary or final causes. It is neutral about them, it's silent about them. Because science is focusing only on those secondary causes. So God, in his greatness, admits true secondary causes. These can be natural or voluntary, but both must be traced back to God. Everything that is done by God, but not without secondary causes. If everything is done by God without secondary causes, that would be called occasionalism. But with secondary causes, that's Thomas Aquinas. That's exactly Thomas Aquinas. So creation establishes the causation from immaterial to material, from atemporal to temporal, from mathematics to science. So why does the material world follow a mathematical law? For me, that is divine action. That is creation. That's what I would call creation. So creation links divine thought to divine action. And we have to realize that divine providence is not in competition with a scientific explanation. Sometimes it seems as if people want to set up a competition. Can science explain this, or do we need God? There is no such competition. Therefore, there's no need for this search of intelligent design, for example, even though there's also nothing wrong with it inherently. But divine providence is not at variance with the randomness that is the basis of natural law. So not only evolution is random, but also physics, quantum mechanics is random. But this randomness is the precise description of a scientist who is caught in this flow of time. So what appears random to us is, of course, not random to somebody who is outside of time, that is God. And this was already also understood by Aquinas, in my opinion. So the reason why the laws of nature are random, based on randomness is always the most precise way to formulate something, in quantum mechanics, but also in evolution. So instead of a deterministic description, we talk about probabilities. That's because we are in the flow of time, and we have to make a prediction about the next step. But if you're standing and just watch the whole trajectory, or lift the trajectory into existence, it's not like that. So there is no randomness from the perspective of God. God does not need to call on random numbers like a computer calls on random numbers. So then I was reminded also to not give sort of the wrong interpretation that I would argue that the human being as a whole is a product of evolution. I don't want to say that. So if we ask the question, is the soul, for example, a product of evolution? Then I would point out that the universe and everything in it is a compound of material and immaterial existence. I think every object in the universe is both material and immaterial. Immaterial insofar as it is in touch with underlying reality. The human being is also a compound of body and soul, as the church teaches us. Mathematical truths, Platonic forms, the soul are not products of secondary causes. It would be very weird to think of mathematical truth as a consequence of a secondary cause or of a Platonic form. In the same way, the soul is not a consequence of a secondary cause, and therefore it cannot be a product of evolution. The soul is not a product of evolution. And then sometimes I'm asked the question, does the universe have a purpose? Because there is a statement out there that science has shown the universe has no purpose and exists for no reason. That's a false statement. You know, science has not shown this, because that statement itself is a deeply philosophical statement that goes far beyond science. But this question, whether the universe has a purpose or not, it is equivalent to one other question, in my opinion, that is the same. And that, interestingly, is simply the question, does God exist? So if God exists, then the universe has a purpose. If God doesn't exist, the universe has no purpose. It's the same. So you could as well ask, does God exist? It is very meaningful to ask, what's the purpose of the universe? What's the purpose of life? And this is very much the contemplation that I'm discussing in the book Beyond. And here, over this, it's written like a musical symphony in like 6 movements, actually, and it's written in this poetic prose. And what it is about is really to argue that the purpose of human life is to find God by love. So all my life I wanted actually to know this. I remember when I was a kid in this school that I showed in the beginning, I heard that one should love God, and I wanted to know, what does that actually mean? What does it actually mean to love God? And that is really the purpose of human life. So God wants to be loved by us. God is thirsty for our love. And to find meaning in this life, you need to experience that love. And I think you can experience that love if you move beyond the confusion that is really caused by selfishness, and therefore the title Beyond. In some sense, to really experience what it means to love God, you have to drop this obsession with the ego. And in Eastern philosophies, which I also described in that book, you embrace the self and neglect the ego. And then you realize that the world is a very different place, and that the world is an immensely beautiful place, and that God is looking at you from every pair of eyes that is actually looking at you. And that is really what this book is about, and that the front cover is Botticelli's Turin Venus. This is the lesser-known Venus. It's not the one in Florence. It's actually in Turin. And it once came to Boston, and the exhibition in Boston was called Botticelli's Search for the Divine. And in the book, there's this interaction between a man and a woman, and the woman is kind of somewhat mysterious and is perhaps a Platonic form, so it's something that leads him out of the cave of shadows. That's what that book is about. And when I was done with this book, something amazing happened actually in my life. I discovered Thérèse of Lisieux. So all my life I have, of course, heard of her, but I have never bothered to find out anything about her. And I was really running away from reading anything about Thérèse of Lisieux somehow. But just between these two books came this moment when I talked to my mentor, Sarah Coakley, and I was very moved by one of the Upanishads, where it is described that the soul, as a drop of water, falls into the ocean to become one with God again. And I asked her if in Christianity we have similar images. And she then said, it's not really our teaching, because in the beatific vision we don't become one with God. But talking about unification with God, I have to read some Christian mystics. And she said I should read Teresa of Avila. So then I read Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle. And I was very, very moved that I could read the words of such a great saint and her experiences. And when I was done with it, I thought, now this is the great Teresa. It was, I thought we always called her the great Teresa and the little Teresa. And so now I know what the great Therese did. Let me find out what this little Therese was about. And then I start to read about her, and I get completely captivated by her. And so what then happened to me happened to tens of thousands of people before, that she becomes a presence in your life, a real presence in your life that doesn't leave you. And this led then to the second book that is completely devoted actually to Thérèse of Lisieux, even though you have to go through the different movements to really discover her, and you have to read it very, very carefully. But it's also the idea that God is waiting for us within, which is Teresa of Avila, both as a lover and as a beloved. And the journey within is also the ascent of Mount Carmel, so the book is really devoted to the three great Carmelite saints and doctors of the church. And it is this journey within is a journey into the human soul, and the human soul is described as a library, an infinite library that gives meaning. And this is somehow the idea of Leibniz, that the whole universe is written into the soul of every single human being, which I like very much. But also that it takes forever to get to know God, and this is really eternal bliss. That we will never be done with our falling in love with God. Also not in the beatific vision, because we will never fully, so it takes forever to get to know God, and therefore every moment you can anew fall in love with God, and that is what is beautiful. And so Teresa of Avila influenced the book, but also John of the Cross and also Thérèse of Lisieux. And I want to end with a few quotes here, and something that has moved me very, very much, that is also in the book. So this is an adaptation that is in my book, is from John of the Cross, of course. So the Father speaks to the Son. In that immense love proceeding from the two, the Father spoke words of profound affection and deep delight, which were meant for the Son. My Son, your company alone contents me. Whatever pleases me, I love that thing in you. Whoever resembles you most satisfies me most. Whoever is like you in nothing will find nothing in me. I find that immensely moving for me. This is how far God's judgment goes, and not further. If you are like Christ in nothing, you will find nothing in me. but not further. And then Teresa of Lisieux, in the heart of the church, my mother, I will be love, and thus I will be all things, as my desire finds its direction. Thank you very much.
So one Humanities Forum tradition is that a student needs to ask the first question. When the microphone comes to you, if you can just state your name, major, and then ask your question.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Michael Pearsall. I'm a philosophy major as well as a seminarian. I was just wondering, is there a difference in the principle of cooperation between rational and irrational creatures?
Yes, yes, I should say yes. So we find cooperation among many organisms and cells in biology that we would not call rational. And we describe that. And then we also use similar mechanisms and game theory to describe so-called rational beings. And one thing that has been missing in that work actually for a long time, and theologians have pointed that out to me, is game theory typically studies the action of somebody. So I help you or not. And game theory does not study the motive behind the action. And I think the most interesting thing with rational beings is what is the motive. And so therefore, in game theory, I no longer use the word altruism, because altruism for me is a human action that is motivated by love. And I have been trying to formulate a game theory of love, but it hasn't, I haven't published that yet. I have tried that in this direction. So how would a saint play a game? These are exactly questions that we are actually analyzing. That is the big difference. What is the motivation? And again, how does a saint play a game? It's a very important question.
Thank you, Dr. Nowak, for being here. My name is Mike. I really appreciate how you kind of started very broad, and then you came down to a very fine point, really ending, beginning with the start of the universe, and then, ending on really Christian ethics. I found that very captivating. My question is more, I guess, it's a comment and what your thoughts are. I remember it once being explained to me that, Aquinas wrestling with Aristotle's, question of is the universe eternal? And one of the answers is, well, because the universe has a beginning and has an end, it has a middle. Because it has a middle, it has a meaning.
It has a what?
Has a meaning. Because you were asking, does the world have a meaning? Do we have a purpose? And that's synonymous with, does God exist? And I find that it's always a very comforting quote, or a very comforting thought, that because we have a beginning, because we have an end, we must have a meaning, right? So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, see, I agree that meaning is only something that comes from God. And in Greek philosophy, there would be no meaning without Platonic forms. So Aristotle and Plato agree that there's no meaning without Platonic forms. And for me, these Platonic forms are those things that are given by God to the human soul. And so it's Augustine who finds the home for the Platonic forms in the mind of God. And so for me, there's this question, sort of where does meaning come from, is one of the deepest questions in human experience, and most people never think about it. And so every single moment for me is a miracle, because in every single moment it is God standing there as a teacher of the soul who gives the meaning.
Alba Espartinas from the Philosophy Department. First off, I want to thank you for presenting the concept of evolution in a scientific, mathematical, and even poetic way. It's actually the first time that I heard of a discussion of evolution done in a poetic way, and that's very salutary. Now, big historians, these are the scientists and theologians who would talk about the theory of the Big Bang, and they would say that there is really nothing in conflict between science and religion when we talk about Big Bang. The question I want to raise is, even this Big Bang would also posit a first cause, which in your presentation we call God. I just want to know, you being a mathematician, would you favor this concept of a prime mover or an uncaused cause, terms that are used by St. Thomas, in positing the very source of this Big Bang?
Yes, so definitely I would say that looking at the world as a scientist, we definitely need a primary cause, and we need a final cause. We need an unmoved mover, and we need an uncaused cause. We need that. And I would go further and say we not only need it for the Big Bang, we need it for every single moment. God is necessary to cause every single moment, has to keep every single moment in existence. So it is not only the Big Bang that is caused by God, but everything is caused by God. This is very important. Sometimes one is making the mistake, God causes the Big Bang and then it's just science. That's actually wrong. God is causing everything. And the Big Bang, one day science might discover a very naturalistic description of the Big Bang, say similar than the birth of a new star. So I would not see the Big Bang as something mysterious. We don't fully understand the Big Bang yet, but there's nothing to say that one day we will not understand it as detailed as we understand, for example, the birth of a new star. So for me, the moment of the Big Bang is just one moment, and God is necessary for every moment.
Hello, Manuel Lopez. Thank you for the talk. Just a question. There are theories of, as you know, of course, very famous theories about how selflessness and sacrifice can be explained in terms of traditional evolutionary theory, in terms of selfishness, right? So Richard Dawkins, of course, kin selection. There's a kind of advantageousness in the selfless act, and I'm not in favor. I think there are problems with that theory, but I'm just asking you more broadly. Could you say that there's a difference between saying cooperation for the sake of selflessness, that is a true and genuine sacrifice for something outside and above you, contrary to your interest, and thinking of cooperation instrumentally, that is, you sacrifice in a secondary sense for the sake of your own gain in a larger sense. And if the second thing is true, then it wouldn't make sense to speak of something like the good of the universe or the good of the whole, because good would just be relative to individual needs and desires, and that would only be true of particular beings in the universe, not of the universe as a whole, right? And it seems like consistent with traditional evolution, right? What's the good of the lamb and being eaten by the lion and so forth, that kind of basic, yeah. Thanks.
I mean, so my view would be that cooperation is ubiquitous in biology, and cooperation includes things like a cell gives its life to feed others with nitrogen. So this existed already 3 billion years ago in cyanobacteria, actually. One cell chooses to die in order to feed other cells with nitrogen. Or in social insects, workers do not reproduce, but they raise the offspring of another individual. All of this is a kind of I would not call it a sacrificial behavior. I would call it cooperation. So it's cooperation, and it shouldn't be too mysterious. And I have sort of shown how evolution gives rise to cooperation. And then if you ask for something bigger in the human realm, I think there's really the possibility to find something more there because of the awareness that we have of God. And then there is a kind of sacrifice that is there that I would put on another level. But I have to think how exactly to describe this. But I think in the human realm, everything changes because for the first time, there is an awareness of God. There is this interaction between a material being and God. And for me, that actually changes everything.
Got time for one more question. It's up here.
I didn't expect to have the last question. I hope it's a good one. I'm Sandra Keating from the Theology Department. First of all, thank you for that. It's absolutely beautiful. And you articulated a lot of things I've been trying to think about for most of my academic career. Maybe this is, it's a very big question at the very end here, but I like the way that you spoke about this idea of God admitting secondary causes. And of course, obviously, the big problem is what do you do with disorder in this order? Everything is, we can see the mathematical structure in the universe. We can see that it points to some divine origin or some kind, well, we can call it divine origin or some kind of order. And I think the question that was asked at the beginning here about what's the difference between human or kind of maybe rational and non-rational reaction. What I'm really asking about is sin and disorder, and what you would say about how, if you have any thoughts about how that happens and why God allows it.
Why God allows sin?
Well, what I mean by sin is that kind of disorder and our ability to choose disorder. You mentioned, the sixth great extinction, which has a probably human cause. We are choosing that, which goes against the mathematical order.
Yeah. Yes. I understand. So I also write about this in Within, especially that what is free will, and I try to argue that free will, the only will that is really free is divine will. Quoting also that it was Augustine who introduces will to philosophy. And for Augustine, divine will is absolutely free. And then we can ask to what extent is the human soul or the human being capable of free will. And I would say that God, in his greatness, has given a spark of this divine will into the human soul. And therefore the human soul, together with this body, has some aspect of free will, but not in the same free will as the divine will is free. I think our free will is only with respect to the purpose that we have in life. And this is to love God. And so we are free to love God. And if this love is meaningful, it also means that you're free not to love God. And for me, this is really what one could call sin, is the choice not to love God, at least for the moment. And this for me is sin, so that the necessity that the human love that God is thirsty for has to be given freely. It comes with the price of having the ability not to love. And that for me is sin.
Please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Nowak.